Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our YouTube channel here with Maine Community Farm. My name's Hope. I'm the Director of Education here, and I'm excited to be coming back to you live with another episode around gardening and agriculture. If you were able to tune in on Monday, we had our very own Jay Villar telling us all about probiotics, and we got some good input on how to make our own kefir and how to make our own sauerkraut, which are two fun activities for being at home and cooking and staying healthy, and also just good nutritional information. So those videos all live on our channel. You can watch them anytime. And we're going to be talking about the idea of reciprocity and how it relates to gardening and how it relates to our lives in general. It's an idea that I've been thinking about quite a bit during this time, this confusing time of staying at home and not being able to see friends and family as much. And I think that collectively we're all experiencing much of the same kind of isolation, maybe confusion and uncertainty. I think there's a lot of fear in the air, and this is an idea that's given me a lot of hope during these weeks. And I think that reciprocity, there's so much of that we see in farming and gardening. So I thought that I could tie this idea that I've been thinking a lot about into this conversation today. So yeah, I think we can jump right in. So I think starting by defining reciprocity is where I'd like to begin. And just as a reminder, there's a chat box on I think the right side of your screen. Feel free to type any comments, any questions, anything that you want to add to what I say. Go ahead and add it, and I'll try and incorporate it into this conversation because I want this to be as reciprocal as we can make it and as much of a live interaction as we can make it. So feel free to drop any questions or comments in there. So what is reciprocity? So reciprocity, if you can think of the word reciprocate, the definition is the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefit. So that's pretty broad. We can think about that in a lot of different capacities. One thing that I think of, we have an electric kettle in my apartment, and I try to always refill my electric kettle so that whoever uses it after me has a full pot of hot water whenever they want to go make something. And it's a good way to, keep harmony in a home when everybody's, indoors. And it's a good way to kind of set the standard and ensure that, I'll be taken care of when I want to go get hot water next. So I think that is, a little example of reciprocity on a smaller scale. On a macro scale, it's putting in effort or some kind of putting in your skill or any kind of effort really in work to receive yield. So reciprocity is exactly what farming is, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, farming and gardening. We're putting in action to the land, and we're receiving harvest in the form of food that sustains us as families and communities. And to me, what reciprocity boils down to is balance, right? So it's balanced relationship on every level. So when I put in good food and lots of sleep with myself, my body gives me more energy and more mental clarity and more patience. I'm always, my body responds to the way I treat it. And that to me is a balanced reciprocal relationship. Same goes for family structures, community structures, the way we treat the land, and it just kind of goes out from there. So the inspiration with this, I've been reading this book. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass: Into Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. It's really been amazing during this time. It's a very in-depth look at, well, the author, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She is a biologist. She's a botanist. She's a professor, an author, a poet. She's amazing. And this is such an in-depth look, this book, at the natural cycles of plants and the way that reciprocity can be incorporated into all of our ecological processes, from farming to forest management to every single biological process can be affected by a mentality of reciprocity. And that's where I've been getting this inspiration, is from her readings. I think the common denominator of all of the stories that she's sharing in this novel they center to me on reciprocity. And I want to tie that into the land and agriculture. So my favorite example in the book that I want to talk about today with all of you is the three sisters of agriculture. So Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of this book, is a member of the Potawatomi nation of Native Americans. And she works closely within this community, and she shares a lot of stories and mentalities and philosophies of that culture in this book. And one of those is reciprocity in agriculture, and I think it's really well exhibited through the story of the three sisters of agriculture. So these three sisters are corn, beans, and squash. So these were three really important crops for Native American communities, and continue to be. And they actually work really well symbiotically together in a way that I think is really exciting. So traditionally, these three crops were planted side by side, all in the same square foot of soil. So actually, when colonists came over to the coasts of Massachusetts, they saw native gardens and thought that these people didn't know how to farm, because from their perspective, from a colonial perspective, agriculture was, every crop had its own bed, and everything was not quite monocropped, but their perspective wasn't so much, one crop and another, and how those two can work together and reciprocate one thing for the other, which we'll see really happens in the relationship between these three crops. So all of these, so the corn, so I do like visual aids. So we've got a corn seed. It looks just like a corn kernel, as you can see. And these are all crops that will exist in our learning garden soon. So that's the corn. And then the bean's quite a bit bigger. This is a scarlet runner bean. It's got the little eye. It's got some pretty scarlet spots on the side. Scarlet runner beans are pole beans. So they'll climb up a trellis or any structure that you leave out in your garden. So there's bush beans, which just kind of grow in a bush and grow beans off of them. And then there's pole beans, which, as we'll talk about, they like to find a vertical structure to grow up. And then this is a squash seed. Having a little, yeah. So it's seed. I don't have any pumpkin seeds, but when in the book, in this story of traditional agriculture, Robin Wall Kimmerer is talking most about pumpkins. But as we've talked about, pumpkins and zucchini and seeds, actually, they look really, so they're all planted side by side at the same time. They were traditionally planted in May when the soil was moist and warmer and ready to sustain a variety of plant life. So the corn takes on the water quickly. It has a pretty thin seed coat, and the water would come into the seed coat, and the enzymes within the seed would trigger growth. So the corn would break soil first. And when the corn pops above the soil, it's just a small white shoot. And if you've ever seen corn in its early days, it just pops up white. And then after a few hours in the sun, it turns green. It photosynthesizes right away, and it's on its way. It's growing vertically, and it's the first crop. And you'll see why. The bean is kind of the second system. The seed bursts, and the first thing the bean does, the first priority, whereas the corn was to shoot up through the soil, the bean's first priority is to send its rootling down into the soil as deep as it can. And that becomes a taproot. And that taproot will be really important for nutrient and water collection later on in the bean's life. But once that taproot is secure in the soil, that's when the stem kind of elbows its way above the soil and then grows. That's my representation. If you've ever seen like a time lapse video of a bean popping above the soil, they kind of bend after their shell has burst and their rootling has gone down in the soil. They kind of elbow their way up and then unfurl, and then they're right up there next to the corn. And the corn, is probably already 6+ inches tall. So yeah, beans number 2, and then the littlest sister is the squash, and the squash takes its time, and it might be weeks before they emerge. And apparently, in the ancestors of this author would sometimes soak these beans in water in a deerskin pouch to help kind of prep it for germination when it's in the soil. And if you've ever planted seeds and soaked your seeds beforehand, you know that sometimes that helps improve germination and speed up the process. So those are the 3 sisters and how they are incorporated into the soil. And they each have a different goal. And each goal is based on the role that each crop will play in this reciprocal relationship that exists between the 3 of them. And I think it's just fascinating. And I'm excited to be sharing about it because it's supposed to grow stiff and straight. Its highest priority is to get vertical height and strength because its younger sister, the bean, it starts to grow some leaves. The corn's continuing to grow. And before long, the bean's mentality changes. And it begins to focus on vining out. So if you've ever seen a bean climb a pole or a trellis, you've seen this in action. The tip of the bean vine, once it's developed and once it's on that mission to grow, it can travel up to 1 meter in a day, which is crazy. We think of plants as not stagnant, but we think of them as these still beings. And bean vines can grow super fast. And I'm excited. I haven't actually grown scarlet runners before, and I'm excited to see in the learning garden what kind of growth they take on. So the tip of the vine is looking for vertical support because it wants to grow up. If a pole bean is left without a vertical support system, it'll turn into this tangled mess on the ground, and it'll be really vulnerable to pests. And once the tip finds something to latch onto, in this case, what do you think it latches onto? Can anybody guess what the bean vine finds? Unless you've set up a pole or a trellis, it has one vertical neighbor that it can climb up. Yes, we've got an answer in the box. It picks the corn. So just like you might have a pole or a trellis in your garden, a corn stalk, assuming it gets its growth in time, assuming it breaks soil first and grows up tall and strong before the bean starts looking for its support structure, the corn stalk will be able to support the bean. And the bean uses touch receptors on its vines to wrap itself spiraling around the corn. And when I first read that, I thought of vines that I've seen in the forest that are kind of choking a tree, or it looks more parasitic than symbiotic to me. But in this case, assuming that the corn has had time to grow, a hardy, strong stalk of at least a little bit of height, right, out of the soil, it can easily support the bean. And then the third sister is our kind of slow runner, the squash. And she starts by extending out over the ground, and she kind of goes her own way for a while. She has roots that kind of reach out on their own, away from the other 2 crops. And yeah, she kind of just wanders along the ground. And if you've ever grown a squash plant, you've seen that they end up taking up a lot of space. So before long, assuming that these 3 crops are planted in the same square foot of soil, the squash's leaves will eventually move into the territory of the beans and the corn. But the positive thing is that squash leaves can grow so wide, and they end up in an ideal situation when these three crops are, all working on the right timetables. These leaves can actually shade the bottoms, the base of each plant, the soil base of each plant, and keep moisture in and keep other plants and weeds out of that territory, so it can improve the overall health of the bean and of the corn. So that's its contribution. So it kind of sounds to me at this point, and maybe you're thinking the same thing, that we know what the corn's role is in this reciprocal relationship. It's the support system for the bean. The squash, its big leaves, once it's taking up enough space in the bed, its big leaves have some really good capabilities to keep moisture in and keep weeds out. So far, it seems like the bean is just kind of getting a free ride. It's just kind of growing up the stalk and hanging out in the sun and getting shaded at its roots by the squash leaves. But the beans have a really important role to play in this reciprocal relationship. Can anybody guess what it is? I can give you a hint. You have to look underground for the bean's role. What do you think? Another hint, beans are in the legume family. And in previous videos, we've talked about what legumes can do. So we have one answer in the chat box: nutrients into the soil. That's absolutely right. And in particular, the nutrient that we're thinking about is nitrogen. So nitrogen is really abundant in the atmosphere, but atmospheric nitrogen isn't readily available for plants to use. We're looking for nitrogen in the soil like ammonium. That is accessible for crops to use. And beans, the legume family, but beans in particular, so our scarlet runners here have this ability. Whoops. Their taproot that we talked about earlier, that first thing that they sent into the soil before they even came above ground, that taproot has the ability, with the help of some other microorganisms in the soil, to create usable nitrogen for other plants in the soil. It also is, like we had in the chat box, it helps to produce other nutrients as well, but nitrogen can be scarce for plants in the soil, and it's a big component in fertilizers, and it's a big component in composts. So having a plant that can be nitrogen fixing, which is what beans are, is a huge benefit for anything else in the bed. So last week we talked a little bit about rotating plants. In the last few episodes, actually, we've talked about rotating plants. And after we grow something like corn, we might want to put something like a bean in the ground to bring some nitrogen back into the soil. So beans are really great to rotate beds with because they can bring some nutrients back in. So that's the relationship of these three plants. And acre for acre, a Three Sisters garden, if it flourishes in the right way, which we don't always have control over, a Three Sisters garden can yield more food acre for acre than if each plant were on their own. And I think that's such a nice example of reciprocity. And I just like thinking of these plants as the strong older sister and the resilient younger or middle sister who kind of finds a way to, get the light that she still helps the others form a unit of three reciprocal plants. And we also see the way that the three plants share water is also pretty reciprocal. So if you've ever pulled up a corn stalk, you've seen that it has these really short roots. It's considered a monocot plant. And if you've ever pulled up scallions in the garden too, they also have these kind of hair-like small, shallow roots. So when the rain comes on this Three Sisters garden, the corn gets the water first, and it drinks its share, and then it releases the rest of the water that it doesn't need. And that goes down to the bean plant. and the bean plant's much, much deeper, and the bean plant gets its water next. And assuming that the corn is the younger sister that we've kind of painted her to be, she'll send her roots in a different direction, and she can kind of go off to the side, and she doesn't interfere with the water system of the other two plants, although they have a very symbiotic relationship of sharing that water. And another way, I could talk about these three plants all day. They are not only companions in the garden, but we see their companionship in food. So these three, or rather in nutrition. So these three crops, they form a really solid diet. And we saw that in indigenous culture when these were the main crops in gardens. And we can see it today too. So we have corn, which is a carbohydrate and a good source of starch. And then we have beans, which are really rich in protein. And then there are many minerals in the flesh of a pumpkin or another squash, vitamins and minerals that can kind of bolster that diet. So each plant on its own, each crop on its own, wouldn't form a complete diet. You can't live on corn alone. You probably can't live on squash alone, maybe. But they each complement each other and fill in the gaps of a complete diet that they wouldn't be able to fill in on their own. So I think it's really interesting that from seed to harvest, these three crops can kind of weave themselves into a relationship that is beneficial for each of them. So how can we tie this into gardening as we know it? How can we think about reciprocity in our gardens and on our farms? I'm thinking right now about, what kind of processes do we see in our everyday gardens that show us examples of reciprocity? And one that I'm thinking of is companion planting. Companion planting is what we've seen represented in the Three Sisters garden, but you can see companion planting in any garden that you visit. So for example, a common companion plant that I've seen in gardens are marigolds. And does anybody know why marigolds are so beneficial for the plants and the crops that they grow near? Sometimes you'll see a bed of marigolds by a field of crops. I've seen farmers and gardeners who plant, a couple of marigold plants at the end of each row. And this is an example of companion planting, but can anyone guess why marigolds are such a great addition to our gardens? It's similar to like a security system, I would say. The benefit is that they repel a lot of the insects and pests that we might see in our gardens. So if you plant your marigolds near beans or squash, they actually repel certain beetles and certain squash bugs. And I just got a comment in the chat box, which is absolutely another benefit of marigolds, is they bring in bees. So they encourage pollination, which is a huge draw of introducing companion planting in your garden. Absolutely. Pollinators are a great way to, planning for pollination is a great way to think about companion planting. A lot of times, when we're talking about companion planting, we're thinking about flowers. Marigolds, nasturtiums are a great companion plant. They can repel insects and bring in pollinators. And even some herbs. Some herbs are great to plant with other crops. And I don't know as much about this, but I have heard some things about how companion planting can impact taste. So I've heard that lettuce, when planted near radishes, can help make the radish more tender and more appealing to eat, which I think I'd like to try out in my garden this year, because I think it would be a fun experiment in companion planting and seeing, how reciprocal these relationships really are, and get to taste the results of my experiment. So companion planting, we see repelling insects, we see pollination, and we see just kind of the use of space. So if we can put more plants in each row and put, a couple of companion planting flowers on the end of each row, we can maximize our space a little bit more, which is beneficial for folks who have maybe smaller gardens but want to get a lot of yield out of their gardens. So can anyone think of any other reciprocal processes in a garden? So we have companion planting, we have herbs and flowers, and I'm thinking of another process that we might see during the winter time. So this is actually a little bit, I would still consider this reciprocal. So in the winter time, when we harvest our crops in the fall before the first frost, we don't like to leave our soil bare, right? We like to have some kind of root structure in the soil to hold our nutrients in, to protect our topsoil from blowing away in the wind or washing away in the rain. Anybody have any ideas what I might be alluding to? An example of reciprocity during the winter time. I'm thinking of cover crops. So I think that cover crops, these producing crops that we plant in the summer. I just got the guess in the chat box, cover cropping. These productive plants that we plant in the spring and summer and early fall, we harvest them out. They leave all this space for cover crops to flourish. And in return, cover crops protect the topsoil, hold the nutrients in, and often replenish some of the depleted vitamins and minerals back into the soil so that next season the plants are ready again to grow and yield food and be productive. So that's another example that I like. So keeping the idea of reciprocity in mind, I'm thinking of another element of reciprocity. So far we've talked about, different plants and how they can thrive together, cover cropping and companion planting and how that can impact our garden. But there's one more huge part of reciprocity in any garden or farming system when we're working with domesticated plants that we haven't talked about yet. And I'm one of these. And I think, our farm manager at Newton Community Farm is one of these. And I don't have a name for really these, but, when we're thinking about reciprocity, humans are a huge part of the process. So farmers and gardeners are a huge part of enabling plants to do this work in the first place. And that's just to say we put in work to prepare our soil, to plant our seeds, to thin our seeds when they're crowding each other, to weed our seeds when they're being choked by weeds. And even harvesting is a form of reciprocity. We're giving our energy to the plant, taking off its ripe fruit so that it can continue to grow and be healthy and produce. And in exchange, these plants just give us and give us and give us more and more food. So that brings me to the book, and I'd like to read an excerpt from it about the idea of farmers and gardeners in the process and kind of in this big circle of reciprocity that we see in garden settings. So when we're thinking about the three sisters of agriculture, the corn, the squash, and the beans, there's a fourth paragraph from Braiding Sweetgrass, which has inspired most of this. So this is the author talking about these crops, the three sisters that we've been looking into. They've all brought their gifts to this table, but they've not been alone. They remind us that there is another partner in the symbiosis. She is sitting here at the table and across the valley in the farmhouse too. He or she. She's the one who noticed the ways of each species and imagined how they might live together. Perhaps we should consider this a four sisters garden, for the planter is also an essential partner. It is she who turns up the soil, who scares away the crows, and she who pushes seeds into the soil. We are the planters, the ones who clear the land, pull the weeds, and pick the bugs. We save the seeds over winter and plant them again next spring. We are midwives to their gifts. We cannot live without them, but it's also true that they cannot live without us. Corn, beans, and squash are fully domesticated. They rely on us to create the conditions under which they can grow. We too are part of this reciprocity. They can't meet their responsibilities unless we meet ours. So I love the idea of this as a responsibility, because I think that brings us back to what we kind of opened this conversation. The idea of reciprocity can absolutely apply to our gardens and our farms, but it also applies to our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with the people in our lives and our greater community, and our relationship with the world. And we have a responsibility to take care of those things so that they can continue to give back to us. And that applies to every level of reciprocity, from the personal to the broadest form of the word, which is, our relationship with the environment. So kind of zooming out on that, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up and leave you with that idea, and that kind of theory of our relationship with each other and the planet being reciprocal, and being a responsibility for us to nurture, to continue to be nurtured by it. And I like that we are just as much a part of that process as our crops and our trees and the animals that share the planet with us. So I'll leave you with that. I hope it brings you hope during these uncertain times, because there is still a lot of hope to be had, and I'm reminding myself of that every day. And before we end, I have exciting growth to show you. Last week in this gardening episode, we talked about warm season crops, cool season crops, and just kind of thinking about prepping our garden and making our garden plans, which I think we'll talk more about. But we also planted some tomato seeds together. So I planted 2 types of tomato seeds. And this was last Wednesday. And these plants have been living in my basement. I would show you my setup, but my basement is kind of scary. I have heat mats, which the trays rest on, and they send heat up to the roots to warm them. And then I have set up above them for warmth a bit, but also just for some light for the plants to grow straight up toward. So in 1 week, drum roll, this is the growth that we've had in our tomato plants. So you can see them all here in this tray, maybe like a ½ inch on a lot of them. So almost all of them have sprouted. We have 2 in the corner here who haven't. And maybe they will, but that's also pretty normal with seeding. Most seeds on the back of the packet, wherever you buy them, will give you germination rate. So sometimes it's like 99, which is great. Most of your seeds are going to germinate, hopefully. And sometimes it's like 80. So usually every tray will have a seed or 2 that just doesn't take, and that's okay. So one thing that I'll show you all before we wrap up, as a living example of reciprocity. If you look at some of these cells, see this one in the front and this one as well. These are probably the cells where I dropped 2 or 3 seeds, which sometimes seed packets will say, put 1 or 2 seeds, or even like 3 seeds. Sometimes with alliums, you do more seeds per cell. But the seed packet will tell you, per cell, which is each individual container, you'll put a seed or 2. So with this plant, I did anywhere from 1 to 2 seeds, which was what the packet told me to do. And sometimes just 1 will pop up, but sometimes 2 will pop up. And to help these plants grow and thrive, my job is, in this relationship, to just pick one out. And I want to be really gentle to take one little seedling out. So then there's just one seedling to develop its root system, to take in the light, to take in water, to take in all the nutrients that it needs. It minimizes competition. And yeah, it helps them thrive a little bit. So that's going to be my job this afternoon, is to thin these guys out. And it only takes a moment, really. But sometimes I use my other hand to kind of hold down the soil around the root that I want to stay in the cell, just so that I don't accidentally rip them all out and then have nothing in the cell. Yeah, and then once each of your cells has one seedling in it, they'll be ready to kind of keep growing and get taller and get hardier and ready to go outside. So that's our growth. Very excited about it. Yeah. And some plants, even when you pull out the little seedlings, I don't think this applies to tomato plants, but some plants you can actually eat the seedlings when you thin them from their seed trays. But I'd have to let you know. I'd have to look that up. All right. Well, to everybody who joined, or to everyone who's watching in the future, I hope this finds you well. I hope this gave you some ideas to think about. Yeah, and some ways to kind of imagine what kind of relationship you can have with your garden, with your community, with your families. And yeah, I'll see you here next week again for more gardening at 1 p.m. on Wednesday. And this Friday, our executive director, Sue, will be doing story time with Sue. So if you have children at home, if you have younger siblings at home, spread the word. And they've been absolutely wonderful. They've de-stressed me on every occasion. And yeah, tune in. And next Monday, we have our Jay Villar, who's going to be talking more about nutrition and how to approach cooking in your kitchen. Yeah, on Monday at 1 o'clock. And a final plug is all of these plants I've been talking about, or maybe not all of them, but definitely marigolds as, a really beneficial flower to have in your garden. That'll be available at our seedling sale this spring. So for more information on that, and for more information on what crops you can get at the seedling sale, go to our website and pay us a visit. And yeah, we'll be back here on Wednesday talking more about your gardens. So yeah, thanks for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.